Ethan Walker didn't flinch when the auctioneer called his name. He just pulled the deed from the man's hand, folded it once, and tucked it into his chest pocket, like it was the only thing in the world worth protecting. His boots were worn through at the heel. His horse was borrowed. And the land he'd just paid every last dollar he owned for hadn't grown a single crop in 4 years. Everyone watching thought he was a fool. Ethan thought they might be right. But he signed his name anyway. If you're just finding this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer Ethan Walker rode into Harlan Creek, Montana, the grass along the road was the color of old bone. The heat had come early that year and stayed mean, curling the leaves on the cottonwoods, cracking the mud along the creek bed into jagged little plates. It was the kind of summer that made men question their decisions, and Ethan Walker had made a very large one. He'd paid $430 for the Alderman place, every cent he had, plus $11 he'd borrowed from a man in Billings who hadn't expected to see it back. The Alderman place sat at the north end of the valley on 63 acres that nobody else had wanted. The fences were down. The well had gone dry 2 summers ago. The barn roof had a hole in it wide enough to park a wagon under, and the house, if you could still call it that, was missing its front door entirely, the frame standing open to the world like a mouth that had forgotten how to close. People in Harlan Creek had opinions about what Ethan had done. "He paid $400 for that," said Roy Cutter at the feed store loud enough that 3 other men could hear. "Man's either stupid or desperate." "Probably both," said the man beside him. Ethan had heard it. He'd been standing 6 feet away loading a sack of oats onto his borrowed horse. He didn't turn around. He just lifted the sack, tied it down, and walked his horse out of the lot without looking back. That was the first day. The second day he started on the well. He didn't have a pump yet. He dug with a spade and a hand auger he'd borrowed from the hardware man in town, a quiet fellow named Amos, who hadn't asked questions and had charged him fair. The ground was hard and dry for the first 4 feet, then it softened into clay. Ethan worked until his shoulders burned and his hands went raw, and when dark came, he stopped, laid the tools against the fence post, and went inside the roofless barn to sleep on his bedroll. He woke before dawn. He started again. By the 4th day, he had water, not much, and not clean, but water. He filtered it through cloth and let it settle and boiled what he needed. He didn't celebrate. He just moved to the next thing. That was how Ethan Walker operated. One problem at a time. One post, one board, one bucket. The people of Harlan Creek watched him from a distance those first 2 weeks the way you watch a man walking a rope over a canyon, half hoping he makes it, half expecting the fall. He wasn't young Ethan. 35 years old, lean through the middle, wide through the shoulder. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had nothing to do with smiling. They came from years of squinting into the wind across open country. He'd worked ranches in 3 states before this. He knew cattle. He knew horses. He knew how to read the weather in the color of the clouds and how to fix a fence in the dark, using nothing but feel and memory. What he didn't know, what he had never been particularly good at, was asking for help. He'd come to Harlan Creek alone. He intended to stay that way. The Hayes Ranch sat 2 miles south of the Alderman place, separated by a long rolling rise of land and a creek that ran clean in the spring and thin in the summer. It was one of the largest operations in the valley. 400 acres good grass, a proper well, a house with glass in every window. Samuel Hayes had built it from nothing 30 years ago, and he ran it with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. Samuel was 61 years old. He was not a large man, but he carried himself like one. He wore the same hat every day, a dark felt brimmed flat and wide. And he had a way of looking at a man that made the man feel he was being weighed and measured, and the results weren't yet decided. He'd heard about Ethan Walker before the week was out. "Drifter from up north," his foreman told him. "Bought the Alderman place at the county auction. Paid cash near as anybody can figure." "Cash," Samuel repeated. "Yes, sir." "What's his business?" "Cattle, I'd guess. He's been asking about prices over in Billings." Samuel didn't say anything else about it. But that evening, he rode the long way home, taking the high ridge road that gave him a clear view north across the valley. He could see the Alderman place from there, the broken fence lines, the bowed roof of the barn, the dark gap where the front door should have been. And he could see a figure moving in the last of the light, working a post-hole digger along the east fence line, steady and unhurried. Samuel watched for a moment. Then he rode home. Charlotte Hayes was 27 years old, and she had strong opinions about most things, including the Alderman place. "It's not worth what he paid," she said over supper that evening, not looking up from her plate. "The soil's leached, the well's dead, and the east pasture floods every spring." "You've been over there?" her father asked. "I've ridden past it 100 times." "Riding past isn't the same as knowing." Charlotte looked up then. "I know the land, Papa." Samuel didn't argue with that. Charlotte did know the land. She'd grown up learning it the way other girls learned sewing and manners. She could read a soil sample by color and texture. She knew which grasses meant good drainage and which meant trouble. She'd been helping manage the Hayes Ranch's planting schedule since she was 19, and she was usually right. "Well," Samuel said, setting down his fork, "whether the land's worth it or not, he bought it. We'll see what he does with it. We'll see how long he lasts," Charlotte said. She wasn't being cruel. She was being practical. She'd watched men come through Harlan Creek before full of plans, and she'd watched them leave when the plans met the reality of that particular piece of ground. She had no particular feeling about Ethan Walker, one way or another. He was simply another variable she had already factored and found wanting. She was wrong about that, but it would take her a while to admit it. The first time Charlotte actually saw Ethan Walker up close, it was an accident. She'd ridden out on a Tuesday morning to check the fence line on the north end of her father's property. They'd lost 2 steers through a gap the week before, and she'd wanted to find where the line had gone soft. She was moving along the creek when she heard the sound, a horse in distress. Not the ordinary kind of protest you got when an animal was being contrary, but the flat, rhythmic, struggling sound of something that had gone down wrong and couldn't get up. She turned her horse and pushed through the brush along the creek bank, and there it was, a bay gelding, gray-muzzled with age on his side in the mud where the bank had given out. The animal's legs were working against nothing, churning slow and exhausted eyes showing white. He'd been down a while, long enough that panic had burned itself out and left behind something closer to surrender. Ethan was already in the creek. He was in it up to his thighs, standing against the current, one hand braced on the horse's neck and the other working a rope under the animal's barrel. He wasn't talking to the horse in that high, soothing way some men did. He was just working deliberate calm, his jaw set and his eyes moving over the problem the way a man reads a map looking for the route. Charlotte stopped at the bank. "You need another rope," she said. Ethan looked up at her. He had a face that was hard to read, not unfriendly but not open either, the kind of face that had learned to keep its own counsel. He looked at her for a second, taking in who she was and what she was offering, and then he looked back at the horse. "I've got the angle wrong," he said. It wasn't an agreement, and it wasn't a refusal. It was just the truth as he saw it. "You've got the rope too far back," Charlotte said. "You're going to pull him sideways. You need it under the shoulder." A pause. "You know horses?" he asked. "I grew up with them." He looked at her again. "There's a second rope on my saddle." She was already moving. Charlotte tied her horse to a cottonwood, pulled the rope from Ethan's saddle, and came down the bank into the water. The creek was cold, colder than the air, and the mud at the bottom shifted under her boots. She worked her way to the horse's head, crouched down, got the rope positioned, the way she wanted it, high under the front shoulder, angled to pull the animal up and forward rather than sideways. "Ready," she said. Ethan had repositioned his rope without being asked. He'd understood what she was doing and adjusted without comment. "On 3, he said. They pulled together. The horse struggled, found purchase with his front hooves, and lurched upright in a spray of water and mud. For a moment he stood there, trembling legs locked and braced, blowing hard through his nose. Then he shook himself, stepped forward, and began moving toward the bank. Ethan guided him up and out. The old horse stood on solid ground, breathing hard, but steady, and Ethan ran his hands down each leg in turn, checking for damage, his face close and intent. Charlotte climbed out of the creek behind him. Her skirt was soaked from the waist down, and there was mud on her hands. She wrung out what she could from the fabric and didn't complain about it. "He's all right," Ethan said. He hadn't taken his eyes off the horse. "He's old," Charlotte said. "Creek banks are tricky at his age." Ethan straightened up. He turned to look at her properly for the first time, not the quick assessment he'd done from the water, but a real look, the kind that actually sees. "You're Samuel Hayes's daughter," he said. "Charlotte Hayes," she said. "You're the man who bought the Alderman place." Ethan Walker. He didn't offer his hand. Not out of rudeness, she could tell that much. He just wasn't a man who rushed toward people. He held still and let her form her own conclusions, which struck her as unusual. "I've heard things about that land," she said. "I expect you have. The east pasture floods. The soil on the North 40 is tired, and you're going to need to regrade the access road before fall, or you won't get a wagon through after the rains." He looked at her for a moment. "You've studied it." "I've ridden past it." "That's not the same as studying it." She blinked. It was almost exactly what her father had said to her reversed. She wasn't sure if that annoyed her or if it was interesting. She decided it was both. "I know this valley," she said. "I don't doubt it," Ethan said. "I'd be a fool to." There was no flattery in it. It was a plain statement, delivered the way he seemed to deliver most things, directly, without ornamentation. Charlotte had spent enough time around men who said less than they meant and meant less than they said that the directness caught her off guard. "The east pasture," she said again. "You should plant it out to winter wheat before you try cattle. The water table's high enough that you'll get a crop even in a dry year, and it'll let the soil recover." Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking at his horse. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "Were you?" "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte studied him. There was something in the way he said it that made her believe him not defensive, not conceding, just honest. He had thought the same thing. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise to seem more competent, and he wasn't going to overthank her to seem more humble. He'd just said what was true. She found that very difficult to argue with. "Well," she said. "Good." She turned and went back to her horse, untied him, and mounted up. She was halfway up the ridge before she allowed herself to look back. Ethan Walker was already moving back toward the Alderman place, leading the old bay behind him, not looking in her direction at all. That night, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table after supper and drew a rough sketch of the Alderman property from memory. The fence lines, the pastures, the position of the well, the slope of the land toward the creek. She wasn't sure why she did it. She told herself it was habit. She told herself she was simply curious about the land, which was true enough. She did not tell herself anything about the man. Samuel Hayes noticed the mud on his daughter's skirt at supper and didn't say anything until they were clearing the table. "Trouble at the creek?" he asked. "A horse went down on the bank. The Walker man's gelding." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "You helped him." "The horse needed help." "You helped him," Samuel said again. It wasn't an accusation. It was closer to a file note, the kind of thing a man stores away to consider later. Charlotte took the dishes to the basin and changed the subject. But her father had a memory, like the land itself, slow to receive impressions, slow to release them. The summer moved the way Montana summers do, hot and long and full of work. Ethan kept to himself, which was his nature. But the valley had a way of making isolation difficult. Harlan Creek was a small town, and a small town had a gravity of its own. It pulled people toward each other, whether they meant to go or not. At the feed store, Ethan ran into Roy Cutter again. Roy was a big man, florid and loud, the kind of man who filled a room with his voice first and his body second. He had a small operation on the west end of the valley that hadn't done particularly well in years, a fact that had made him progressively less generous in spirit. Walker. Roy said, leaning against the counter like he owned it. I hear you're planning on wheat. Ethan set his list on the counter for Amos to fill. That's right, on the Alderman place. Roy said it the way people said things when what they meant was something else entirely. That's right, Ethan said again. Man before you tried wheat. Year before that man tried barley. Year before that, I know the history of the land cutter. Roy paused. He wasn't used to being interrupted, and he wasn't used to the particular quality of stillness that Ethan Walker had, the kind that wasn't passive, that was more like a loaded thing, waiting to be either used or put away. Just saying, Roy said. Lot of men have tried to make something of that ground. None of them planted winter wheat in August, Ethan said. He picked up his supplies and walked out. Roy watched him go. Stubborn, he said to no one in particular. Amos, behind the counter, didn't say anything, but he smiled slightly, and he filed the moment away in the same place. He filed a lot of things about Ethan Walker under the heading of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and wasn't going to explain it to people who hadn't asked seriously. On a Friday afternoon in the third week of July, Ethan was working the north fence line, new posts, new wire. The kind of work that took time and muscle and no particular inspiration when he heard hoofbeats on the ridge road. He didn't look up immediately. He finished seating the post he was working on, tamped the earth around its base, and then straightened and looked north. It was Charlotte Hayes. She pulled up at the fence line, his new fence line. He noticed the section he'd finished 3 days ago and looked down from the horse at his work. She had that way about her he'd come to understand in the short time since the creak of looking at things directly and making up her mind without apology. Wire spacing's tighter than standard, she said. Cattle lean against wire, Ethan said. Standard spacing invites them to try. A pause. My father uses 12-inch spacing on the south pasture for the same reason. Your father knows cattle. Charlotte looked at him. He'd like to talk to you. That surprised him. He didn't show it, but it surprised him. About what? He didn't say specifically. She paused. He doesn't usually explain himself in advance. It's a habit. I can respect that. Can you come Sunday? Ethan looked at the fence post in his hand, at the long line of work still ahead of him, at the sky that was already turning toward evening. I can come Sunday, he said. Supper, Charlotte said. 6 o'clock. She turned her horse and rode back up the ridge without waiting for a response, which was, Ethan was beginning to understand, also a habit. He stood there a moment looking after her. Then he turned back to the fence and drove in the next post. Saturday night, Ethan cleaned his one good shirt with water from the well and spread it on a fence rail to dry in the morning air. He polished his boots with a piece of cloth and the last of the tin he'd bought in Billings 3 months ago. He did these things without ceremony, the way he did most things, because they were the right things to do, not because he expected them to matter to anyone else. He'd been to ranch suppers before. He knew what they were, part hospitality, part assessment. A man invited you to his table to see how you held a fork and what you said when you weren't talking about work, and whether you were in the end the kind of man he could trust his land and his business near. Ethan understood that. He had no quarrel with it. A man who built something worth protecting had every right to be careful about who he let close to it. He just had to make sure that when Samuel Hayes looked at him across that table, what he saw was what was actually there. Not more, not less. Just the truth of it. Sunday came in bright and windless, the kind of late July day that had some mercy left in it before August arrived and took mercy away entirely. Ethan rode down to the Hayes Ranch at 5:45, came in through the gate, and tied his horse at the post by the water trough without being asked where to go. A man who'd worked ranches his whole life knew where to tie a horse. The house was large and well kept, the kind of house that had been added to over years rather than built all at once. You could see the seams of it, the places where a room had been added or a porch extended, the evidence of a life that had grown and required more space to hold it. There were flower boxes under the front windows, which surprised him slightly. He hadn't pictured Samuel Hayes as a man who kept flower boxes. He knocked at the door. Charlotte opened it. She was wearing a blue dress, plain and well-made, and her hair was back in a way that was more formal than it had been at the creek or on the Ridge Road. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly, without prelude. "You're early," she said. "I'm on time," he said. She considered that for a moment. "Come in, then." Samuel Hayes was in the front room, standing by the window with a cup of coffee, already looking at Ethan when he walked in. The man had that quality of attention that made you feel your entrance had been noted and catalogued before you got through the door. "Walker," Samuel said. "Mr. Hayes." Ethan took off his hat. Samuel looked him over the shirt, the boots, the hat in hand. He had the kind of eyes that were doing more than looking. "Sit down," he said. They sat at the table, all three of them, and supper was served: roast and potatoes and bread that Charlotte had made that morning, which Ethan could tell because the flour was still lightly visible in the crease of her wrist when she set the basket down. For the first 10 minutes, they talked about the weather and the grass, and the price of beef in Billings, which was the language of the valley, the real language, the one that meant something. Then Samuel set down his fork and looked at Ethan. "I hear you're planting winter wheat on the North 40, he said. "That's right?" "In August. Last 2 weeks of August. It needs to establish before the first frost." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Most men around here would say that's too late." "Most men around here haven't tried it," Ethan said. "There's a farm in central Wyoming, man named Galt, been planting that variety that late for 6 years. Gets a better yield than the spring crop in 4 of those 6 years. Samuel looked at him steadily. "You know Galt. Worked his place for a season years back. He's a careful man. He measures things." "So do you," Samuel said. It wasn't a question. "I try to," Ethan said. Charlotte had been quiet through most of this, but Ethan was aware of her, the way she held her cup. The slight adjustment of her attention when something said at the table was more interesting than it appeared. She was listening to everything. She was filing everything. He understood that about her now, she collected information the way other people collected opinions, and she trusted the information more. "I want to ask you something," Samuel said, "and I want you to answer me straight." "Yes, sir." "What do you intend for that land?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "To make it a working ranch. Cattle on the south pasture once the fencing's done, wheat on the north 40, and I'm looking at a small apple orchard on the east slope, if the soil test comes back the way I think it will." "An orchard," Samuel said. "Long investment," Ethan said. "Takes time, but the slope faces right, and the soil at that elevation holds moisture longer. I think it'll do." Samuel picked up his fork again, which was not nothing. A man didn't pick up his fork if he was about to argue. "The water rights on that creek property are complicated," he said. "You know that—" "I've read the deed 3 times, Ethan said. "I know what I have and what I don't. I'm not looking to take what isn't mine." That landed in the room quietly and stayed there. Charlotte looked at Ethan. Then, not the swift assessing glance she'd given him at the creek, not the careful observation from the Ridge Road, but something longer. Something that was closer to recognition. Samuel didn't say anything for a moment. He ate. He drank his coffee. And then, "You'll need help with that well before the summer's out. The aquifer on the Alderman place runs deep. I had a man drill for me 2 years ago. Good equipment, knows the ground. I can send him to you." Ethan was quiet. "I don't need charity," he said. "Not hard, just clear." "It's not charity," Samuel said. "I've got use for that North 40 being productive. A working neighbor is better than an empty one. That's business." A long pause. Ethan looked at his plate. He turned this over the way he turned most things, carefully checking the angles of it, making sure he understood what it was. "I'd appreciate the name of the man," he said finally. "I'll pay him fair." Samuel nodded once. "Fair's all I ask." They finished supper. The evening cooled slightly as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Charlotte poured coffee, and they sat out on the porch in the near dark, and the conversation moved to other things, The creek. The fall gather a piece of land on the south end of the valley that was rumored to be going up for sale. When Ethan stood to leave, Samuel walked him to the gate. They shook hands, and Samuel held the handshake a moment longer than necessary, the kind of extra second that means something. "Walker," he said. "Mr. Hayes." "You're doing the work right," Samuel said. "I'll give you that." It was not lavish praise. It was barely praise at all. But from Samuel Hayes, Ethan understood it was a significant thing. He rode home in the dark with the stars thick overhead and the nighthawks calling, and he didn't let himself think too much about the porch in the last of the light, or the way Charlotte Hayes had looked at him when he'd said he wasn't looking to take what wasn't his. He had too much work to do. That was what he told himself. He was telling himself the truth. He just wasn't telling himself all of it. The week after supper at the Hayes Ranch, Ethan drove the last post on the north fence line and stood back to look at what he'd built. 412 feet of new wire, tight and level, every post seated 2 feet deep in ground that had tried its best to resist him. He ran his hand along the top wire once, not checking it, just feeling it, and then he picked up his tools and went to start on the well. The driller Samuel had sent was a man named Pete Burrows, short and tobacco-stained, who arrived Monday morning with a mule-drawn rig and the particular confidence of a man who had spent 30 years finding water underground and was never wrong about it. He walked the property first without speaking, hands in his pockets, looking at the ground, the way Ethan looked at fence posts, not at the surface, but at what was underneath. 40 feet, Pete said finally. Maybe 45. You've got a seam running northeast under this whole flat. It's good water, cold. How long? Ethan asked. 3 days if the rock cooperates. 4 if it doesn't. What do I owe you? Pete named a figure. Ethan paid half up front from the folded bills he kept in the inside pocket of his coat, and Pete shook his hand and went to work. Charlotte rode by on the second day. She didn't stop at first. Ethan saw her on the ridge road moving at an easy pace, and he didn't wave or call out, which was his way. But she slowed, and then she stopped, and then she turned her horse down the slope toward the property line. "He found water," she called. 42 feet, Ethan called back. "Hit it this morning." She walked her horse closer, looking at the rig, at the dark, wet core samples laid out on the ground beside it. "What's the flow?" "Pete says 8 gallons a minute. Says it won't quit." She was quiet for a moment, studying the samples. "My father will be glad to hear it." "I'll tell him myself," Ethan said. "I owe him that." Something shifted in her expression, not much, just a small adjustment around the eyes. She nodded once and turned her horse back toward the ridge. She was 10 yards away when she stopped without turning around. "The east pasture," she said. "The soil's better closer to the creek line than it looks. If you run your seed rows parallel to the water, rather than perpendicular, you'll use the moisture gradient and get better germination." A pause. "I know," Ethan said. She turned her head just far enough that he could see the edge of a reaction, not quite a smile, not quite something else either, and then she rode up the ridge and was gone. Pete Burrows watched her go from beside his rig. He looked at Ethan. He looked back at the ridge. "Neighbor?" he said. "Neighbor's daughter," Ethan said. Pete made a sound that wasn't quite a word and went back to work. But he was smiling at the ground, and he didn't bother to hide it. The seed went in during the last week of August, just as Ethan had planned. He worked the North 40 from first light to last, the borrowed seed drill pulling steady behind his horse row after row across ground that hadn't been asked to produce anything in 4 years. The soil surprised him. It came back easier than he'd expected, looser beneath the dry crust, darker. Good ground that had only been tired, not ruined. Roy Cutter watched him from the road one afternoon, sitting his horse with his forearms crossed on the saddle horn, not saying anything for a long while. "You're late," Roy said finally. Ethan kept walking the drill forward. "I know what I'm doing, Cutter." "Last man planted late on that ground. The frost took him before he could establish." "Last man used spring wheat," Ethan said. "Different variety, different roots." Roy was quiet again. Then, You're going to look real foolish come October." Ethan turned at the end of the row, straightened the rig, started back the other direction. "Then I'll look foolish in October," he said. "Meantime, I've got rows to finish." Roy sat there another minute. Then he rode on. Amos, who had been passing by on the road in his wagon and had heard the whole exchange, waited until Roy was out of sight and then pulled up even with Ethan's fence. "Don't mind him," Amos said. "I don't," Ethan said. "He lost his best pasture to bad seed 2 summers back. Makes him critical." Ethan glanced over. A man who's failed at something always thinks he knows exactly why someone else is going to fail the same way. Amos thought about that for a moment. "That's a true thing," he said. "That's a real true thing." He clicked his horse forward and rolled on down the road, and Ethan went back to his rows. By the end of the week, the North 40 was planted. He stood at the edge of it in the early evening and looked out across the disturbed earth, the clean geometry of the seed rows, the first faint suggestion of moisture already rising from the ground. He felt the way he always felt when he finished something, not satisfied exactly, but resolved, like a question had been answered at least for now. He went inside and made coffee and sat at the table with the land deed spread out in front of him, reading the water rights clauses again by lamplight. He'd read them a dozen times. He read them again anyway. There was a section in the deed that bothered him. A clause about the creek access. It was written in the loose language of 20 years ago, the kind of language that could be read 2 different ways, depending on who was reading and what they needed it to say. He'd been carrying it around in the back of his mind for weeks. Not worried exactly, but aware of it, the way you're aware of a weather sign that might mean nothing and might mean everything. He folded the deed and put it back in his coat pocket. There were things he could control and things he couldn't. He'd learned that lesson on enough different pieces of ground in enough different states that it had stopped being a frustration and become simply a fact, like the distance between fence posts or the number of hours in a working day. He put out the lamp and went to sleep. The first green showed on the north 49 days after planting. Ethan was checking the fence on the east side when he saw it, the faintest wash of color across the dark soil. The new shoots barely an inch high, but unmistakably there, unmistakably alive. He crouched down and looked at the nearest one up close. Healthy, even. The root was seated right. He stood up. He didn't say anything. There was no one to say anything to. He just looked at it for a long moment, and then he went back to the fence. Charlotte saw it 2 days later from the Ridge Road, and she pulled up her horse and stared at it for a solid minute before she made herself ride on. That evening, she told her father. "His wheat is up," she said. Samuel looked up from the ledger he was working. "Already." 9 days in, even germination across the whole 40. He got the soil prep right. Samuel was quiet for a moment. He looked back at his ledger, but he wasn't writing. "Came up fast," he said. "He planted the right variety," Charlotte said. "I looked it up after he mentioned Wyoming. It's a winter-hardy strain, shorter establishment window than the common seed. Most men around here don't use it because you have to know when to put it in." And he knew. Yes. Samuel turned a page in the ledger that didn't need turning. "You've been watching his operation. I ride that road every week, Papa." "Charlotte." She looked at him. "I'm not criticizing," Samuel said. He met her eyes with the directness that was a family trait, something she'd inherited from him, and sometimes resented for that reason. "I'm noting." "There's nothing to note," she said. Samuel went back to his ledger. "I'm sure?" he said in the tone of a man who is not sure at all and has decided to say nothing further about it. Charlotte took her coffee cup to the window. The Ridge Road was dark and empty. The lights at the Alderman place, at Ethan's place, she corrected herself, were just visible over the rise, a single lamp in the window of the house. She watched it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she went to bed. It was Roy Cutter who first said it in public, and it was at the feed store, which meant everyone heard it within 48 hours. "Hayes girl's been riding past that drifter's place every day this week," he said, helping himself to the free coffee Amos kept on the stove. "Every single day." There were 3 men in the store. None of them said anything, but all of them filed the information away. "Just saying," Roy added. "Samuel Hayes might want to know what his daughter's doing with her mornings." Amos wiped down the counter without looking up. "Charlotte Hayes has been riding that ridge road since she was 12 years old," he said. "It's the direct route to the North Grazing Land." "The Hayes North Grazing Land is on the other side of the valley," Roy said. Amos put down his cloth. He looked at Roy with the particular patience of a man who had been listening to Roy Cutter for 15 years and had developed a precise measure of what he was worth. "You got an order today, Roy," he said. "Or are you just visiting?" Roy put down his coffee cup and left. But the thing had been said, and things that get said in small towns take on a life that has nothing to do with whether they're true. Jiao. Samuel Hayes heard it on Thursday. It came to him indirectly the way things do in a place like Harlan Creek, not as a piece of gossip delivered directly, but as a careful, almost apologetic remark from a man he'd done business with for years, who said only that people were talking and that Samuel might want to be aware. Samuel thanked the man for telling him and rode home. He didn't say anything to Charlotte that night. He sat through supper and talked about the fall gather and the price of beef and what the weather had been doing, and Charlotte talked back about all of it the way she always did, knowledgeable, clear-headed, more interested in the land than in anything else. He watched her. He'd been watching her for a while now, he realized, since the night she'd drawn that sketch of the Alderman property and left it on the kitchen table where she thought he wouldn't notice. He'd noticed. He'd looked at it for a long time. After supper, he sat on the porch in the dark and thought about what he knew and what he didn't. What he knew: Ethan Walker was a careful man who did things right and didn't take shortcuts and understood land. He was quiet in a way that was not weakness. He had come to the valley with nothing but skill and intention, and he was building something real from the worst piece of ground available. What he didn't know whether real was enough, whether skill was enough, whether a man with no land, no family name, no standing in the valley was ever going to be in a position to offer his daughter anything that matched what she was worth. He sat with that for a while. Then he went inside and put out the lamp and lay in the dark for a long time before he slept. The confrontation, when it came, didn't look like one. It was a Saturday morning, and Ethan had ridden into town for supplies. He was at the counter with his list when Samuel Hayes walked into the store. The two men looked at each other. There was nothing aggressive in it, nothing overt. Just two men in a small room, both of them aware that there was something in the air between them that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. "Walker," Samuel said. "Mr. Hayes." Samuel picked up a few items he needed, brought them to the counter. He stood beside Ethan while Amos filled both their orders. The silence between them was the kind that had weight to it, not hostile, but occupied. Then Samuel said very quietly, "My daughter knows this valley better than most men in it." Ethan didn't look at him. He was watching Amos mark down the tally. "I know that," he said. "She's not a woman who makes careless decisions," Samuel said. Ethan was quiet for the moment. "No, sir, she's not." Another silence. Samuel picked up his package. He was at the door before he stopped. "She told me about the wheat variety," he said without turning around. "Said you already knew to plant parallel to the creek line." "I did know," Ethan said. "But you listened to her tell you anyway." A beat. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. Samuel pushed open the door. "Sunday supper." "Walker, same time." He walked out. Amos had been studying the ceiling during this exchange. He looked back down at his counter now and wrote down the last of Ethan's order without comment. But his hand was steady, and his mouth was doing something it didn't do very often. Ethan paid his bill and picked up his supplies and walked out into the sun. He stood there for a moment, feeling the heat on his face, thinking about what had just happened. It had not been approval. It hadn't been anything as clear as that. But it had been something. An extension. An opening, narrow and conditional, that had not existed before. He wasn't going to waste it. Sunday supper was easier than the first one. Not easy, but easier. The particular tension that had occupied the table 3 weeks ago had shifted slightly the way weather shifts when a front is moving through the pressure still there, but moving rather than static. Charlotte had made a roast again and bread, and there was a jar of honey someone had given Samuel in payment for a debt which sat on the table between them, like a small ceremony. They talked about the wheat first, because the wheat was the safest ground-neutral territory, where everyone's knowledge was roughly equal and the conversation was mostly facts. "Tiller count looks good," Ethan said. "If we don't get a hard frost before mid-October, I think it'll establish." "Weather's been holding," Charlotte said, "but September can turn fast in this valley." "I know September," Ethan said. "You've wintered in Montana before. 3 times. 2 of them on the east slope. The cold comes different out here than it does on the flats. It drops faster, and it holds." Charlotte was looking at him with the expression she got when information was interesting to her. "East slope of the Bitterroots. Closer to Missoula. Worked a spread there for 2 seasons. Man named Hartley. Good operation." "I know that name," Samuel said from the head of the table. "Hartley sold out 6 years back?" "7," Ethan said. "His son didn't want it. Hartley didn't want to see it broken up, so he sold the whole thing to one buyer. Took less money for it than he could have gotten." Samuel looked at him. "Why'd you leave?" "He sold," Ethan said simply. "I don't stay where there's nothing left to build." That sat in the room for a moment. Charlotte set down her fork. She wasn't looking at her plate. She was looking at the table at some point between her plate and Ethan's, as though she was reading something there that wasn't visible to anyone else. "Is that why you came here?" she said. "To build something?" "Yes, ma'am." "Just for yourself?" Ethan looked at her. It was a direct question, and he gave it what it deserved, which was a direct pause. "I don't know yet," he said. "I know what I'm building. I don't know yet who it's for." The room was very quiet. Samuel reached for the honey jar and said with the practiced neutrality of a man changing a subject that had gotten somewhere faster than he expected. "You'll want to look at your east pasture drainage before the first rain. That low corner floods, and it'll undercut your fence posts." "I was going to put in a French drain along that line," Ethan said. "Good idea." "I'll need to rent the tool." "I've got one you can borrow," Samuel said. "Come by Tuesday." Charlotte picked up her fork again. Her face was composed, but her eyes, when she looked up once more at Ethan across the table, said something that neither of them was ready to say out loud. "Not yet." Tuesday came. Ethan went to the Hayes Ranch for the drain tool, which was kept in the equipment shed at the back of the property. Charlotte happened to be there when he arrived, sorting through seed packets at the workbench along the back wall. She heard him come in and didn't turn around right away. She said, "The drain tool's on the left wall, 3rd hook from the window." He found it and took it down. He checked it over. The way he checked all borrowed tools, the condition of it, how it had been maintained, what it said about the man who owned it. It was in good shape, oiled and clean, the blade sharp. "How long do you need it?" Charlotte asked. She still hadn't turned around. 2 days, Ethan said. "Maybe 3 if the ground's stubborn." "It won't be. The soil on that side is loose. You'll be done in 2. "You know the east pasture that well." Now she turned. She had a seed packet in her hands, and she was looking at him the way she always did, level and clear, and like she was making a decision about something. "I walked every inch of this valley when I was growing up," she said. "My father used to take me with him when he inspected the land boundaries. I was 12 years old walking property lines in the August heat, and he'd stop every 30 feet and ask me what I noticed." "What did you notice?" Ethan asked. "Everything," she said. That was the point. He was quiet for a moment, turning the tool over in his hands. "He taught you well." "I know," she said. She said it without any false modesty, and without any pride either, just the flat truth of it, the way Ethan spoke. "He wanted me to understand what we had, what it cost to build, and what it cost to lose." "Sounds like a man who'd been through both," Ethan said. He had been. She paused. He lost everything once. Before I was born, drought took the first ranch, the one in eastern Montana. He had to start over from nothing. This place is the second attempt." Ethan looked at her. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't," she said. "He doesn't talk about it. He built it into how he does things. Everything is done right the first time because there might not be a second chance." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about Samuel Hayes, sitting at the head of his table, the way the man moved and spoke and held himself. The precision of it, the weight behind it. It made more sense now. All of it made more sense actually, knowing that the solidity of the man had come from loss. "He looks at you," Charlotte said, "and sees someone doing it the same way. First time right, no shortcuts. It matters to him." "I'm not doing it for him," Ethan said. "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." They looked at each other. The shed was warm, and the dust of summer was in the air between them, and the seed packets in Charlotte's hand were making a quiet sound in the breeze from the open door. It was an ordinary moment. It was not a small moment. "Tuesday after next," Charlotte said very carefully. "I'm going to ride the south fence of your east pasture. I want to see how the drainage runs after you've put the French drain in." "You're welcome to," Ethan said. "I know I am," she said. She turned back to her seed packets. "Bring the tool back when you're done." Ethan carried the drain tool out into the sun. He tied it to his saddle, mounted up, and rode back north. He didn't allow himself to think about her all the way home. He thought about the drainage problem instead, the angle of the slope, the depth of the cut where the water would run. He was almost back to his property before he realized he was smiling, and by then there was no one to see it, which suited him just fine. The last Saturday of August was market day in Harlan Creek, the kind of day when the town filled up with people from all over the valley, wagons on the main road, and horses at every post, and the particular loud sociability that came from people who'd been mostly alone for weeks, finally seeing each other. Ethan didn't go to market days as a rule. He went to town when he needed things, and he needed things on his schedule, not the calendars. But he was out of lamp oil, and he'd run short on a particular grade of wire, and so he went and he arrived at 10:15 to find the main street as crowded as he'd expected. He made his purchases without incident. He was tying his horse to leave when Roy Cutter appeared from the other direction with two other men, both of whom Ethan recognized from the feed store, but didn't know by name. "Walker," Roy said in the loud voice he used when he had an audience. "I hear you had supper at the Hayes place, twice." Ethan didn't stop tying off his horse. "That's right. Twice in a month," Roy said. He looked at the men beside him with an expression that was doing a specific kind of work, the kind that wasn't quite a smile that required other people to fill in the meaning. "Samuel Hayes must be feeling generous." "Samuel Hayes is a fair man," Ethan said. He straightened up and looked at Roy directly. "He saw work being done right and he said so. That's not generosity. That's just what decent people do." Roy's expression adjusted. "His daughter seems to think the work's worth watching." The street wasn't quiet, but the particular pocket of it around the two men had gone still. Two women near the dry goods store were not pretending to look at fabric. The man outside the barber had stopped pretending to read his paper. Ethan looked at Roy for a long moment. "Charlotte Hayes," he said, "knows more about soil and drainage and land management than most men in this valley, and she shares what she knows because she wants the valley to do well. That's her character. If that's what you're commenting on, you might want to think about whether your own character's in good enough shape to earn you the right." The silence around them had gotten very complete. Roy's face had gone the color of brick. He opened his mouth and then he closed it, and the two men beside him were looking at different parts of the street. Ethan picked up his horse's reins and led him forward past Roy down the street. He heard Amos's voice behind him from somewhere near the feed store doorway. "You need any help loading that wire, Ethan?" "I'll manage," Ethan said without looking back. "But I appreciate it." He kept walking. That evening, sitting on the front step of the house in the cooling air, Ethan heard hoofbeats on the ridge road. He recognized the horse before he could see it, a particular gait, a particular pace. He didn't get up. Charlotte pulled up at his gate and looked at him over the fence. "I heard what happened at market," she said. He looked back at her. "News travels fast." "In this valley, faster than that." She paused. "You didn't have to say that. I said what was true," he said. "Same as always." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the look that he was coming to understand was her version of feeling something she hadn't yet found the language for. "My father heard too," she said. "I figured." He didn't say anything. He just came home and fixed the hinge on the barn door that's been loose for 3 weeks. Ethan looked at her. "That's how he says things," Charlotte said. "When words aren't enough. He picks up a tool." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "I know the type," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The evening was cooling fast the way Montana evenings do, the air sharpening at the edges, the first stars showing. "Tuesday after next," Charlotte said. "I'll have the drainage done by then," he said. She nodded once. She turned her horse and rode back up the ridge. Ethan sat on his step and watched the last light leave the sky, and he thought about a man who fixed a hinge when he meant something else entirely, and about the way character showed itself in the actions a person chose when no one was making them choose. He thought about wheat growing in the dark. He thought about water running in the direction you gave it, following the channel you built for it, finding its level. He thought about that for a long time. The French drain went in on schedule 2 days, exactly just as Charlotte had predicted. Ethan returned the tool to the Hayes equipment shed on a Thursday afternoon and found Samuel there, instead of Charlotte oiling a saddle on the stand by the door. Samuel looked at the tool, looked at Ethan, and nodded once. "Done already." "Ground cooperated," Ethan said. "Charlotte said it would." She was right. Samuel kept working the oil into the leather. He had a methodical way with his hands, the same careful attention Ethan recognized from his own work. Every stroke, deliberate, nothing wasted. "Water running clean?" he asked. "Clean and fast. Pulled the corner out in 4 hours once I got the channel set." Samuel nodded again. He set down the oilcloth and looked at Ethan with the particular directness that was the man's version of opening a door. "Sit down a minute," he said. Ethan sat on a hay bale near the door. Samuel stayed standing, which was his way when he was thinking hard about something. "There's talk in town," Samuel said. "I know," Ethan said. "Roy Cutter's behind most of it." "I know that too." Samuel looked at him. "It doesn't bother you?" "What Roy Cutter says about me doesn't change what I'm doing or why," Ethan said. "I can't stop a man from talking. I can only keep my work clean enough that the talk doesn't stick." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. He picked up the oilcloth again, not to use it, just to have something in his hands. "The talk isn't only about you," he said. Ethan didn't look away. "I know what the talk is about, Mr. Hayes. And I want you to know that I've never said or done anything that wasn't respectful toward your daughter. Not once. Not when we're alone, not when we're not." The shed was quiet. Outside, somewhere across the yard, a horse moved in its stall. "I know that," Samuel said. His voice was flat and certain. "If I didn't know that this conversation would be a different kind of conversation." "Yes, sir." Samuel set the cloth down on the saddle stand and looked at Ethan directly. "My daughter is not a woman who makes careless choices," he said. "She's also not a woman who can be told what she thinks. I learned that about her when she was 16 years old, and I haven't unlearned it since." Ethan waited. "I'm not telling you to stay away," Samuel said. "I'm telling you I'm watching. And I'm telling you that I expect a man who borrows my tools and eats at my table to be the same man when I'm not looking as when I am." "I'm the same man every hour of the day," Ethan said. "I don't have another version." Samuel looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the oilcloth and went back to the saddle. "Tuesday after next," he said. "Charlotte mentioned she's riding your east fence line." "She's welcome to," Ethan said. "I know she is," Samuel said. I'm coming with her. Ethan stood up, took his hat from his knee, and put it on. You're welcome to that too, he said. He walked out into the afternoon sun and rode home, and he thought the whole way back that Samuel Hayes was the most honest man he'd met in a long time, and that honesty in a man who had the power to make your life difficult was a more complicated thing than it looked. September arrived like a change of mind suddenly, without the gradual cooling Ethan had been hoping for. The nights dropped hard the first week of the month, cold enough that he could see his breath in the mornings, cold enough that he started worrying about the wheat, which was established, but not yet through the critical tillering stage. He was out on the North 40 before dawn, 3 days running, crouching at the row edges in the dark, with a lamp, checking the soil temperature with his hand, the way his first boss in Wyoming had taught him. Not just the surface, but 2 inches down, where the root zone was. It was holding. Barely, but it was holding. Charlotte and Samuel rode out on the Tuesday as planned. Ethan met them at the gate. Samuel looked at the east pasture. First walked the drainage channel Ethan had cut, crouched down, and felt the soil moisture at the low corner, the way a man checks something he's been wondering about. He stood up without comment, which was its own comment. Charlotte walked the fence line. She ran her hand along the wire, checked the corner bracing, looked at the post spacing. She was thorough, and she was fast, and when she came back to where Ethan was standing, she said, "You reinforced the corners differently than standard." "Double braced," he said. "This soil heaves in spring. Standard bracing pulls loose." She looked at the corner post. "You've seen that happen." 3 times, he said. "On 2 different properties. Once in Wyoming, twice in Idaho. After the 3rd time, I stopped trusting standard." She nodded slowly, and there was something in the nod that was more than approval of the fence work. Samuel, coming back across the pasture, watched his daughter nod and watched Ethan watch her nod and said nothing whatsoever. They walked the North 40 together. After that, the 3 of them, and the wheat was the subject for 20 minutes: row spacing, tiller development, the soil temperature problem, what Ethan planned to do if the cold came hard before October. Charlotte had thoughts. Samuel had thoughts. Ethan listened to both, agreed where they were. Wright pushed back where he had information they didn't, and they went back and forth across it, the way people who know what they're talking about can go back and forth. No performance, no posturing, just the problem and the possible solutions. It was the best conversation Ethan had had in years. He knew better than to say so. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of September, and it changed everything. Ethan picked it up at the post office in town, a single sheet in an envelope from the county land office in the territorial capital, and he read it standing on the boardwalk outside the post office door without moving for a long time. The letter was formal and dry, and it said in the careful language of official documents that a challenge had been filed against the recorded deed for the former Alderman property, the property now held by one Ethan Walker, on the grounds that the original sale had included an error in the water rights notation that materially misrepresented what was being conveyed. The challenge had been filed by a land agent named Gerald Price on behalf of an unnamed party. A hearing had been scheduled at the county land office in 6 weeks. Ethan read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and stood there on the boardwalk with the morning traffic of Harlan Creek moving past him, and thought through it carefully and systematically, the way he thought through problems that had the potential to take everything apart. The water rights clause, the one he'd read 12 times and known, was loose. Someone had found the looseness and was using it. He went to see the only lawyer in Harlan Creek, a man named Edward Moss, who kept an office above the dry goods store, and who came to his door at Ethan's knock with the mildly harassed expression of a man who had been interrupted from something he considered more important. Ethan showed him the letter. Moss read it once, read it again, and sat back in his chair. "You know what they're claiming. They're saying the deed I bought conveyed rights to the creek access that weren't the seller's to convey," Ethan said. "They're saying the original surveyor made an error and the creek water rights on the east side of my property never legally belonged to Alderman. And if that's true, then I don't have legal access to the water that feeds my east pasture," Ethan said. And the drainage work I've done is on a corridor I have no right to use." Moss was quiet for a moment. "Who filed it?" "A land agent named Gerald Price." Moss's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. "I know Price," he said. "He represents a number of buyers who have been acquiring land in this valley over the past 2 years, quietly, piece by piece." Ethan looked at him steadily. "Someone wants my land. Someone wants the water," Moss said. "The Alderman property sits at the head of the East Tributary, controls access to about 800 acres worth of downstream water rights if you hold the source. Your land isn't particularly valuable. The position of it is." Ethan sat with that for a moment. He felt something settle in his chest. Not fear, not quite anger either, but a cold, clear kind of resolve that he recognized from other moments when things had gotten serious. "What do I need to do?" he said. "You need the original survey, the one from when Alderman first filed. If the water rights were properly recorded at the time of his acquisition, Price's claim falls apart. If they weren't, where do I get the original survey?" "County records, the territorial capital." Moss paused. "It's a 4-day ride." "I know how far it is," Ethan said. He stood up. "What do you charge?" Moss named a figure. Ethan did the arithmetic against what he had left and what he'd expected to have by spring. It was possible. Barely possible, and it would cut deep into the margin he'd been counting on to get through the winter. But it was possible. "Draw up what you need drawn up," Ethan said. "I'll be back tomorrow with half." He walked out and rode home and sat at his table with the deed and the letter and the ledger he kept, and he went through every number he had twice, and then he made his decisions and stopped looking at the numbers. He didn't tell anyone that night. He wasn't ready to tell anyone. This was his problem, his land, his fight. He'd handle it the way he handled everything one piece at a time, starting with the most important piece. He was saddling his horse for the ride to the capital 2 mornings later when Charlotte rode up. She looked at the bedroll on his saddle, the saddlebags packed heavy, the road gear, and she pulled up her horse and looked at him. "Where are you going?" she said. "Territorial capital," he said. He kept tightening the cinch. "Why?" He stopped. He turned and looked at her. She was watching him with the expression that meant she was already halfway to knowing and was asking because she wanted him to tell her himself. "I got a letter from the county land office," he said. "Someone's filed a challenge against my deed." The color in her face didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. "The water rights," she said immediately. He looked at her. "You know about this." "Not about your deed," she said. "But I know about Price. He's been buying land in this valley for 2 years. He bought the Connolly place in the spring. Old Connolly needed the money, took what Price offered, and found out afterward the offer was half what the land was worth. Price represented a buyer who nobody's been able to identify." She paused. "My father tried to find out who the buyer was. He couldn't." Ethan finished with the cinch and straightened up. "I need the original survey from Alderman's filing," he said. "If it's clean, the challenge fails. If it isn't—" "It's clean," Charlotte said. He looked at her. "I've seen it," she said. 3 years ago, when the Alderman place first went to auction, my father had me research the title history. The water rights were properly recorded in 1871. The surveyor's notation is clear. Whoever's telling Price there's an error in the deed is either lying, or they found an error somewhere in the chain between 1871 and now." Ethan was quiet. "You're certain?" "I wrote down the recording number," she said. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, old crease-worn, the kind of paper that had lived in a pocket for a long time. She held it out to him. He took it. He unfolded it and looked at it. It had a number, a date, a notation in Charlotte's handwriting. He looked at it for a long moment. "You've had this," he said. "Since the auction," she said. "I looked up the title because I was curious about the land. I keep notes." He looked at her, really looked at her the way he'd looked at the wheat when it came up, the way he looked at a fence corner he'd built right. There was something happening in his chest that he'd been carefully not naming for weeks, and he still wasn't going to name it, not here, not now. But it was there, and it was solid, and it was not going away. "I still need to ride to the Capitol," he said. "I need the original document, not just the number. The lawyer needs something he can put in front of the hearing." "I know," she said. "I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying take that number with you and go to the East Records room first. 3rd floor. The 1871 surveys are in the bound ledgers on the north wall." He folded the paper and put it in his inside pocket next to the deed. 4 days there," he said. "If you ride straight," she said. "I'll ride straight." She looked at him steadily. "Ethan." It was the first time she'd used his given name. Just that one word said plainly, and it hit differently than anything else she'd said in 2 months of knowing him. He stayed very still. "Be careful," she said. "Always am," he said. He mounted up. He looked down at her from the horse, and she looked up at him, and neither of them said the thing that was in the air between them, because neither of them was quite ready to say it yet, and both of them knew it, and that was all right. He touched the brim of his hat and rode south. Done. He was gone 6 days, not 4. The records room took longer than expected. The 1871 ledgers had been reorganized at some point, and the recordings weren't where they should have been, and Ethan spent most of the second day going through the bound books shelf by shelf until he found the right one. The notation was exactly where Charlotte had said it would be. The water rights were properly recorded. The chain was clean. He sat in the records room with the book open in front of him and felt something he hadn't felt since the deed had gone into his pocket at the auction. The particular relief of a foundation confirmed solid. He had Moss's clerk copy the relevant pages. He paid the copying fee. He rode back in 2 hard days and arrived in Harlan Creek on a Friday evening, horse tired and himself not much better, and went directly to Moss's office. Moss looked at the documents for 10 minutes without speaking. Then he set them on his desk and looked at Ethan. "This is what we need," he said. "Price's challenge is going to fall apart at the hearing. Whoever told him there was an exploitable error in this chain was either wrong or was hoping you wouldn't find this. Or was hoping I couldn't afford to find it," Ethan said. Moss considered that. "That too," he said. "A lot of men in your position with 6 weeks and limited funds would have tried to negotiate or settle rather than ride to the Capitol and pull records." "I don't settle what I've earned," Ethan said. Moss looked at him. "No," he said, "I don't imagine you do." Ethan left the documents with Moss and rode home. He unsaddled his horse, watered, and fed him, checked the wheat by lamp in the early dark, and found it holding. The cold had stayed at bay. The tillers were developing the way they should. The ground was doing what good ground does when you treat it right. He went inside and made coffee and sat at his table. He pulled out the piece of paper Charlotte had given him, the folded, crease-worn page with the recording number in her handwriting, and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. She'd had that paper for 3 years. She'd kept it in her pocket. He thought about that. The next morning he rode to the Hayes Ranch before breakfast. Samuel was at the barn when he arrived, already working. He looked at Ethan and looked at the road behind him and said, "You're back." "Got in last night," Ethan said. "I found the survey. Water rights are clean. The challenge is going to fail." Samuel was quiet for a moment. He set down what he was holding. "Good," he said, and then, after a pause that had things in it, "Sit down. There's coffee." They sat on the bench outside the barn with coffee, and Ethan told him what he'd found, what Moss had said, what the hearing was likely to look like. Samuel listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when something mattered. "Price," Samuel said when Ethan finished. "I've been trying to find out who he's working for. Nobody in town knows." "Or nobody's saying," Ethan said. "That too." Samuel turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You know, when I built this place, there was a man who tried something similar. Said my east boundary survey was wrong, that I'd built a fence on his land. Took me a year and money. I didn't have to prove him wrong." He paused. "Turned out, he wanted the water on my east boundary the same way someone wants yours." Ethan looked at him. "What happened?" "He lost," Samuel said simply. "I documented everything and he lost." He paused again. "But the year it took, that was a hard year. Don't let them make it a hard year for you." "I don't intend to," Ethan said. Samuel nodded. He looked toward the house. "Charlotte asked after you every day you were gone," he said. It was said matter-of-factly, the way he said most things without embellishment. Just set on the table between them like an object that needed to be acknowledged. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "She gave me the recording number before I left," he said. "Had it in her pocket from when she researched the title 3 years back. That's what sent me to the right place first." "I know," Samuel said. "She told me." "She thinks ahead," Ethan said. "She always has," Samuel said. He looked at his coffee. "She's also not wrong very often. About land, about people. It's something you learn to trust." He said nothing further. He didn't need to. They sat in the morning quiet and drank their coffee, and the silence between them was the kind that had arrived naturally, without being negotiated. Charlotte came out of the house 20 minutes later with bread from the morning bake wrapped in a cloth, and she stopped when she saw Ethan sitting with her father, and the stopping was only half a second, but Ethan saw it. She composed herself and walked over and handed the bread to her father without looking at Ethan yet. "I didn't know you were back," she said. "Got in last night," he said. Now she looked at him. The full look, the one she saved for things that mattered. "You found it. 3rd floor north wall, just like you said," he said. 1871 survey. Clean chain." Something crossed her face. Relief, he thought, and something underneath the relief that was more personal and that she controlled quickly. "Good," she said. Her voice was steady. "I'd have been looking in the wrong room for 2 more days without the recording number," he said. She met his eyes. "You would have found it eventually." "Maybe," he said. "But I wouldn't have found it in time to ride back before the cold breaks the wheat." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly conversational. Then she looked at her father. "Breakfast is ready," she said. Samuel stood up. He looked at Ethan. "You'll stay," he said. It wasn't a question. Ethan looked at the bread in Samuel's hand, at the house, at Charlotte, who was already walking back toward the door and not looking back, but with the particular quality of not looking back. That meant she was listening for his answer. "Thank you," Ethan said. "I'll stay." They were nearly through breakfast when the sound of a horse coming fast up the road made all 3 of them go still. It was the Hayes foreman, a quiet man named Dolan, who had been with Samuel for 12 years and who didn't ride fast unless something was wrong. He came through the gate and pulled up hard and looked at Samuel with the expression of a man who has bad news and is trying to figure out the cleanest way to deliver it. "Fire," Dolan said. "North end. It jumped the creek line." Samuel was on his feet before Dolan finished the sentence. "Which side?" Dolan looked at Ethan. "Both sides," he said. Ethan was already moving. The fire had started in the dry grass on the ridge above the valley. Nobody knew how yet, and it didn't matter yet, and it had come down the slope fast in the overnight wind and jumped the creek at the narrow point where the banks were close, and now it was running south through the dry September grass toward the north end of the valley, toward the Hayes North pasture, toward the Alderman place, toward Ethan's wheat. They rode hard. Samuel took 2 of his ranch hands and the water wagon and went for the creek line. The priority was stopping the spread before it reached the main pasture where the Hayes cattle were ranging. Dolan went with him. Charlotte started after them. "Charlotte," Samuel said sharply. "I know how to fight a fire," she said, and she kept riding, and Samuel let her go because he knew better than to spend time arguing what he couldn't win. Ethan rode north toward his own land. The smoke was visible before he reached the property line, heavy and dark, moving fast south on the wind. He came over the rise and saw it. The fire was running along the east side following the dry grass corridor between the fence line and the creek, and it was moving toward the North 40, toward the wheat. He didn't stop to think. He pulled up at his barn, grabbed the spades and the heavy canvas sacking and the water barrel he kept filled because he'd always kept a water barrel filled, and he pushed his horse toward the fire line. The heat hit him 50 yards out. He got off the horse and tied her to the fence away from the smoke line and went forward on foot, which was the only sane way to fight a grass fire. Horse can panic, but a man on the ground can feel what the fire is doing under his feet. He started on the north edge of the wheat field, cutting a break line with the spade, turning the soil to bare dirt, working fast and low against the smoke. The fire was 60 yards east and moving. He had maybe 20 minutes before it reached his line. He worked. He didn't think about the months of work in that field. He didn't think about the money. He thought only about where to put the next spade cut, how wide the break needed to be, whether the wind was shifting. He heard hoofbeats and looked up. Charlotte. She came off her horse at a run, grabbed the second spade from the tools he'd brought, and without a word started cutting the break line on the south end where his reach wasn't. She'd tied a cloth across her face, and she was moving fast, reading the ground the way she read everything quickly, accurately, without wasted motion. "Wind's pushing east," she said between spade cuts. "I see it," he said. "If it shifts back west, the break line needs to be wider on the north end." "I know," he said. He kept cutting. They worked side by side in the smoke, and the heat not talking except about the fire, where it was moving, where the line needed to go, what the wind was doing. It was the most honest kind of working together, the kind where there's no room for anything but the problem in front of you. The fire reached the east fence line. It hit the bare dirt of the break and slowed. It pushed at the edges, found the south gap, and Charlotte was already there, beating it back with the wet sacking. Ethan came down from the north end, and they held the line together side by side for 20 minutes. That felt like an hour. Then the wind died. The fire without wind lost its push. It burned itself out against the break line and went to ground, leaving a black scar along the east edge of the property and the smell of scorched grass and turned earth. Ethan straightened up. He looked at the wheat. It was untouched. Every row, every green shoot standing exactly as it had been this morning. He looked at Charlotte. She was looking at the wheat too. Her face was streaked with smoke. Her hair had come loose, and there was a burn mark on the sleeve of her coat from where a piece of the sacking had caught. She hadn't said anything about that. She was looking at the wheat with the expression of someone who has been very afraid of something, and is looking at the proof that the thing they feared didn't happen. "It's all right," Ethan said. His voice came out rough from the smoke. "I know," she said. She didn't move for a moment. "I know." Then she turned and looked at him, and the fear that had been in her face for the wheat rearranged itself into something that was harder to look at directly. Something that had nothing to do with the wheat at all. Ethan looked back at her. Neither of them said anything, because there in the smoke and the September cold with the black burn line behind them and the green wheat still standing, some things were past saying and were simply there, present and certain, the way water finds its level and stays. Samuel arrived 20 minutes later with Dolan and the ranch hands. He came through the gate, and he saw the break line, and he saw the wheat, and he saw Ethan and Charlotte standing 8 feet apart, not touching, not speaking. Both of them watching the edge of the burn, the way people watch something that nearly cost them everything. He pulled up his horse. He looked at all of it for a long moment. "Fire's out on my side," he said finally. "Lost some fence on the east boundary. No cattle." He looked at Ethan. "Your wheat held." "It held," Ethan said. Samuel looked at his daughter. He looked at the burn mark on her sleeve. He looked at the 2 spades driven into the ground side by side at the break line. He dismounted. He walked to the break line and crouched down and felt the turned soil with his hand, the way he'd felt the drainage channel and the fence posts and the soil samples, checking the quality of the work, measuring what it had cost and what it had saved. He stood up. He looked at Ethan Walker, and the look on his face was not what it had been 4 weeks ago in the equipment shed, and it was not what it had been at the market, and it was not what it had been at any supper table. It was something older than approval, something that had to be earned the hard way and couldn't be given any other way. "Good work," Samuel Hayes said. He said it to Ethan, but he said it looking at the wheat. And Ethan understood what it meant, all of it, every word that wasn't in those 2 words. And he nodded once and said, "Thank you, sir." And that was enough. That was more than enough. The burn mark on Charlotte's sleeve didn't heal overnight, and neither did everything else the fire had left behind. The east fence line on the Hayes North pasture needed 4 days of work to replace posts burned through at the base wire, warped and slack from the heat. Samuel put his ranch hands on it the morning after the fire, and Ethan showed up at dawn without being asked and worked alongside them. Nobody made a remark about it. Dolan handed him a post digger without ceremony, and they worked until dark, and when Samuel came out at noon with coffee and looked at the line of new posts already standing, he didn't say anything. He just poured Ethan's coffee first. That was the first shift. Small, almost invisible, but Ethan felt it. The second shift came 2 days later, when Roy Cutter rode past the property while Ethan and the Hayes hands were still working the fence. Roy pulled up and looked at the mixed crew. Hayes men and Ethan Walker working the same line, and his expression went through something complicated that ended in his horse turning and moving on without Roy saying a word. Dolan watched him go. "First time I've seen that man leave without talking," he said. One of the other hands laughed. Ethan kept driving his post, but he'd seen Roy's face in that moment of silence. He'd seen what it looked like when a narrative a man had been carrying collapsed under the weight of evidence. Roy had been telling a story about Ethan Walker, drifter fool man, who'd wasted his money on dead ground, and the story didn't fit anymore, and Roy knew it, and knowing it sat on him like a stone. Ethan didn't feel triumphant about it. He just noted it the way he noted weather, and moved on. The hearing at the county land office was scheduled for the 3rd week of October. Ethan rode into town to meet with Moss 10 days before to review the documents and understand what to expect. Moss was in good form, the careful, precise kind of confidence that came from having a strong case well documented. He spread the copied survey pages on his desk and walked Ethan through the chain of title point by point. "The 1871 recording is airtight," Moss said. "The water rights notation is specific and clearly attached to the land parcel. Whoever told Price there was an exploitable error, either misread the chain or lied to him." "Which do you think?" Ethan asked. Moss considered. "I think someone found an ambiguity in the 1884 resurvey. There's a notation change that looks like an error if you're reading fast and not carefully, and represented that ambiguity to Price as more significant than it was. Whether that was negligence or strategy, I can't say. Price is still hiding who he's working for. The filing names Price as agent with no identified principal," Moss said. "That's legal but unusual. The hearing officer will likely press on it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Moss, who in this valley benefits from controlling the east tributary water. Moss took his glasses off and cleaned them. He was being careful. "There are 3 properties downstream of your land that currently depend on that tributary for summer irrigation. All 3 have been approached by Price's buyer in the last 2 years. 2 of them sold. One of them, the Hartley descendant over on the east bench, refused. If someone controlled the source water, Ethan said, they'd have leverage over every acre downstream." "Yes," Moss said, "they would." They sat with that for a moment. "It's bigger than my deed," Ethan said. "It was always bigger than your deed," Moss said. "You were just the next piece." Ethan rode home thinking about that. He thought about the 2 properties that had already sold. He thought about Old Connolly, who Charlotte had said took half what his land was worth. He thought about the Hartley descendant holding out alone on the east bench. He thought about what it meant to be the piece in a larger puzzle without knowing you were a piece. He hadn't bought the Alderman land to be anyone's obstacle. He'd bought it to build something. But if holding it meant that someone else's plan for this valley didn't work, then he was going to hold it, and he was going to hold it clean. He told Charlotte the evening before the hearing. She'd ridden over after supper on the pretext of checking on the wheat, which was doing well. The cold had stayed merciful through most of September, and the tillers had developed fully, and the field was as established as he'd hoped. She knew all this already. She'd been watching it as carefully as he had. She came to where he was standing at the field's edge, and stood beside him in the near dark, and they looked at the wheat together in the last of the light, and then Ethan said, "It's not just about my land." She was quiet. "Price has been buying the valley piece by piece," he said. "My land is part of it, the water source. If he gets control of the east tributary at the head, every property downstream is dependent on whoever owns the source." Charlotte turned to look at him. "The Hayes South pasture," she said. "We draw from that tributary in July and August, when the main creek runs low." "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking it through the same fast, thorough way she thought through everything, pulling all the pieces toward the center, finding the shape of it. "If you lose the hearing," she said. "If I lose the hearing, whoever buys the water rights has leverage over your father's south pasture in dry years," Ethan said, "and over the Hartley bench, and over the two properties Price already bought. They'd hold the whole east end of the valley." She absorbed that. She looked back at the wheat. "You're not going to lose," she said. It wasn't reassurance, it was a statement of what she believed based on what she knew. "I know," he said, "but I wanted you to know the full picture. It wasn't fair not to tell you." She looked at him. The look was direct and serious, and had something underneath it that was personal and warm, and that she kept controlled because she was Charlotte Hayes, and control was something she'd grown up practicing. But it was there. "Thank you," she said, just that. 2 words in the dark beside the wheat field. "Thank your father, too," Ethan said. "I need him to know before the hearing." "He'll want to come," she said. "He's welcome to." She nodded. She didn't leave right away. They stood there another minute in the dark, not talking, and the silence was the kind that didn't need to be filled, the kind that had settled in between two people who had spent enough time together, that quiet was a form of company. Then she said, "The wheat's going to make it." "It is," he said. "You were right about the variety," she said. "About the timing, about all of it." He looked at her. "You weren't wrong about anything either," he said. "The creek line rose the drainage, the record room. None of it would have worked the way it did without what you knew." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the most you've said at one time," she said. "I meant all of it," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned and went to her horse and rode back toward the Hayes ranch, and Ethan stood by his wheat field until he couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. Dapu. Samuel Hayes came to Ethan's door at 7 in the morning on the day of the hearing. He knocked once, and when Ethan opened the door, Samuel was already in his good coat and hat, holding his horse's reins, expression settled and certain. "Ready," Samuel said. Ethan looked at him. Samuel Hayes had driven 4 days to rebuild his first ranch from nothing. Samuel Hayes had fought a boundary challenge alone for a year with money he didn't have. Samuel Hayes had come to his door this morning without being asked in his good coat, prepared to walk into a hearing room beside a man who'd worked his land for 5 months and had no claim on Samuel's time or loyalty except the kind that can't be written in a deed. "Ready," Ethan said. He got his hat. Charlotte was waiting at the gate with 2 of the Hayes ranch hands also in their good clothes. She looked at Ethan when he came out, and she didn't say anything, but what was in her expression said enough. They rode into Harlan Creek 5 people together, and people noticed. In a small valley, the composition of a group says something. 5 people riding together to a hearing said this is not just one man's problem. People on the street watched them pass and understood something was happening, and by the time they tied their horses in front of Moss's building, a good portion of Harlan Creek understood the shape of the day. The hearing room was the large back room of the county assessor's office, plain and functional, with a table at the front for the hearing officer and chairs arranged in rows. When Ethan walked in with Samuel and Charlotte and Moss, Gerald Price was already there. Price was a thin man in an expensive coat with the kind of careful grooming that came from having enough money to spend time on it. He had a lawyer with him, someone from out of county, which was itself a statement, and two other men whose function wasn't immediately clear. Price looked at Samuel Hayes when Samuel walked in, and something moved behind his eyes. He hadn't expected that. The hearing officer was a territorial appointee named Kavanaugh, who had the expression of a man who had sat through enough land disputes to find most of them boring and was still capable of being interested by one that wasn't. He called the room to order and stated the matter simply a challenge to the water rights notation in the deed recorded in the name of Ethan Walker on the grounds of an error in the chain of title. Price's lawyer went first. He was smooth and prepared, and he built his case carefully around the 1884 resurvey notation, the ambiguous one Moss had already found, arguing that the change in notation represented an uncorrected error that invalidated the water rights conveyance in Ethan's deed. It was a good argument. Ethan could see why someone had thought it would work. Then Moss stood up. Moss was not a dramatic man. He didn't perform. He simply presented the 1871 original recording, walked Kavanaugh through the chain of title, with the patience of a man who understood documents, and showed notation by notation that the 1884 change was a surveyor's formatting revision, a standardization of language across all county records that year, and not a substantive change to the rights recorded. He then produced a letter from the county land office, confirming this, which Ethan had obtained on his ride to the Capitol, and which Moss had been holding until this moment, with the particular satisfaction of a man who knows exactly when to put his best card on the table. Price's lawyer objected. Kavanaugh overruled him. There was a short recess. During the recess, Ethan stood near the back of the room, and Price crossed to him. Price's composure was intact, but there was something underneath it that was no longer quite as certain as it had been an hour ago. "Walker," Price said. His voice was low, not hostile, the tone of a man making a business calculation. "Your position is clear. I respect that. But there are other considerations." "Such as?" Ethan said. "The land itself," Price said. "You've done good work on it. Real work. My client can see that. There might be value in a negotiated arrangement, continued operation, fair compensation." "Who's your client?" Ethan said. Price paused. "I'm not at liberty." "Then we don't have anything to negotiate," Ethan said. "A man who won't put his name on what he wants doesn't want it for good reasons." Price looked at him for a moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, and then it was finished. "Your call," he said. He walked back to his side of the room. Samuel, who had been close enough to hear the exchange, said nothing. But when Ethan glanced at him, Samuel was looking at Price's back with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew. Kavanaugh came back. He took 10 minutes to review the documentation Moss had presented. Then he ruled. The challenge was denied. The water rights notation in Ethan Walker's deed was valid and properly recorded. The chain of title was clean. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Kavanaugh said in the flat voice of a man adding something because he thought it needed to be said, "I'll also note for the record that the pattern of challenges filed by the agent Price in this county over the past 18 months warrants review by the Territorial Land Commissioner. I'll be sending that recommendation with my report." Price's lawyer gathered his papers. Price himself didn't look at Ethan or Samuel. He walked out with the two men whose function had never been made clear, and the door closed behind him, and the room let out a breath it had been holding. Moss shook Ethan's hand. The Hayes Ranch hands shook his hand. Samuel shook his hand last, and held it a moment longer than the others, and said, "Well done," in the voice he used when he meant considerably more than the words. Charlotte didn't shake his hand. She was standing near the window, and when the handshakes were done, and the room was starting to empty, she looked at him across the space between them with an expression that was composed and calm and completely unguarded in a way he had never seen from her before. All the assessment and the careful management of what she felt set aside just for this moment, just for him. He looked back at her, Samuel, who missed very little, chose that precise moment to turn to Moss and say something about the documentation, and both men found the papers very interesting, for about 30 seconds. Ethan crossed the room to Charlotte. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard." "Your father?" "I know what my father did," she said. "He didn't do it for the water rights." A beat. "No," Ethan said. "I don't think he did." She looked at him steadily. "What happens now?" she said. "I go back and finish what I started," he said. "The wheat needs to come through the winter. In spring I'll start on the south pasture fencing for cattle. The orchard goes in next fall, if the soil test holds." "That's the land," she said. "What about everything else?" It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him. And Charlotte Hayes did not say direct things carelessly. Ethan looked at her for a moment. He thought about the right answer, the careful answer, the answer that didn't move faster than the ground they'd built under themselves. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "If your father's willing, and you're willing. No rushing. Done right." She held his gaze. "I've been watching you do things right for 5 months," she said. "I know how you work." "Yes, ma'am," he said. Something moved across her face, not quite the smile she'd withheld for 5 months, but close, very close, the near side of it. "Then ask my father," she said. "He's standing 10 feet away pretending to read that document upside down." Ethan looked. Samuel Hayes was indeed holding Moss's document at an angle that suggested he had not looked at the contents once. Ethan looked back at Charlotte. The almost smile was still there. He turned and walked to Samuel. Samuel Hayes listened to Ethan with the document still in his hand, looking at Ethan the way he'd looked at fence posts and field breaks and well cores, measuring thorough, taking the full weight of what he was being shown. When Ethan finished, Samuel was quiet for a moment. "You understand," Samuel said, "that Charlotte is not a woman who needs rescuing." "I know that," Ethan said. "She's pulled me out of more trouble than I've gotten her into." Samuel's expression shifted barely a millimeter in the direction of something that had warmth in it. "She has a way of doing that," he said. "I'm not asking to rescue her," Ethan said. "I'm asking to build something beside her. If she'll have me. If you'll give me that chance." Samuel looked at the document in his hand. He set it down on the nearest chair. He looked at Ethan with the full weight of all 61 years of him, the first failed ranch, the second attempt, the hard years, the good ones, the daughter he had raised alone since her mother died, and whose judgment he trusted more than anyone else's. "She's already made her choice," Samuel said. "She made it before you asked. I've known that for weeks." He paused. "What I'm deciding is whether you're the man who deserves to receive it." Ethan didn't say anything. This was the moment for listening, not for talking. Samuel looked at him for a long time. "You didn't take shortcuts," Samuel said. "On the land, on the legal fight on this, everything you've done has been done straight." He picked up his hat from the chair beside the document. "I'm not a man who changes his mind easy," he said. "But I'm not a man who ignores what's in front of him." He put his hat on. "You have my blessing," he said. "Don't waste it." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "I won't," he said. "You have my word." Samuel nodded once. He picked up his gloves. "Sunday supper," he said. "I believe there are things to discuss." He walked out of the room, and his boots on the floor had the particular sound of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Ethan stood in the empty hearing room for a moment. Then he walked back to where Charlotte was waiting near the window. She had heard none of the words of his conversation with her father. They'd been across the room, but she had watched her father's face the whole time, and she could read her father better than anyone. "Well," she said. "Sunday supper," Ethan said. She looked at him. "There are things to discuss," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "You asked him properly." "I did." "And he said yes." "He said Sunday supper." A pause. "That's yes," she said. That's his, yes. He looked at her. I know, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and what was in her face now was not the composed, careful expression she wore like a second coat most of the time. It was something quieter and more real, the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something with more patience than anyone knew, and has just received confirmation that the waiting was worth it. All right, she said. Her voice was steady. Sunday supper, then. She put on her hat and walked toward the door. At the doorway, she stopped. She turned halfway. Ethan, she said. Charlotte, he said. She held his gaze for one more moment, and whatever she'd been holding back for 5 months moved across her face all at once. Everything she'd kept controlled and careful and measured for the whole length of their knowing each other present, now visible and certain. Then she walked out into the October light. Ethan stood alone in the hearing room for one more moment. He put on his hat. He thought about 63 acres of ground that nobody had wanted, and a well that went 42 feet before it found cold, clean water, and a field of winter wheat that had survived a fire and a frost and a legal fight and was still standing. He thought about what it meant to build something right. He walked out into the light after her. The Sunday supper after the hearing was different from all the ones before it. It wasn't louder. It wasn't more ceremonial. Samuel Hayes didn't make a speech or pour anything special or change the arrangement of the table. He made the same roast. He poured the same coffee. He sat in the same chair at the head of the table that he always sat in. But the room had a different quality to it, the way a room feels after a long storm has passed and the air has settled into something cleaner and more permanent than what was there before. Charlotte had set 3 places, same as always, but she'd put the breadbasket in the center instead of at her father's end, which was small and said something. Ethan came at 6 o'clock. He knocked at the door. Charlotte opened it. She was wearing the blue dress again, the same one from the first supper, plain and well made. And she looked at him, the way she'd been looking at him for weeks now, without the careful layer of assessment over everything. Just direct. Just Charlotte. You're on time, she said. I'm always on time, he said. I know, she said, and she stepped back and let him in. Supper started. The way supper always started between these 3 people, with the language of the valley. The real language, the one made of practical things. The wheat. The east fence repair. The fall gather on the Hayes North pasture that Dolan had managed with 2 hands short. Ethan had helped with that too 3 days the week before, which Samuel had noted and not remarked on, which was its own remark. But partway through the meal, Samuel set down his fork and looked at Ethan with the particular quality of attention that meant he was done talking around something. I want to say something, Samuel said. Ethan waited. I was wrong about you, Samuel said. He said it the way he said everything that cost him something straight. No softening, no apology layered around it. Just the truth, delivered clean. When you bought that land, I thought you were a man who didn't know what he didn't know. I was measuring you against what you had instead of what you did. That was my error. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You were protecting what mattered to you, he said. I can't fault a man for that. I'm not asking you to fault me, Samuel said. I'm asking you to know that I see clearly now. What you built on that ground, how you built it, why I see all of it. He picked up his fork again. And I see the way my daughter looks when she talks about the drainage work on your east pasture. He said it without looking at Charlotte, but the corner of his mouth moved. Soil drainage has never made her look like that before. Charlotte said, Papa. I'm noting. Samuel said mildly that I'm not criticizing. Ethan looked at his plate and did not quite smile. I appreciate what you've said, Mr. Hayes. Samuel, the older man said. Ethan looked up. You've eaten at my table enough times, Samuel said. Call me Samuel. It was 3 syllables. It was not a small thing. Samuel, Ethan said. Charlotte reached for the breadbasket and didn't look at either of them, but her hand was completely steady and her face was doing something careful and private that she was choosing not to share with the room. The Territorial Land Commissioner's inquiry into Gerald Price's pattern of challenges arrived in Harlan Creek 3 weeks after the hearing in the form of a letter to Moss and a separate communication to the county assessor. The inquiry confirmed what Kavanaugh had suspected. Price had filed similar challenges against 6 properties in 2 counties over 18 months, always on behalf of the same unnamed buyer, always targeting land with water source access. Moss brought the letter to Ethan on a Wednesday morning, riding out to the property with it folded in his coat pocket. Ethan read it at the fence line where he was working, standing in the October cold with the paper in his hands. "They're opening a full investigation," Moss said. "The unnamed buyer has been identified, took the commissioner's office some doing, but the financial trail led back to a land speculation company out of St. Louis. 3 partners. None of them have ever set foot in Montana." Ethan folded the letter. "Men buying land they've never walked," he said. "Happens more than it should," Moss said. "They see water rights on a map, and they see leverage. They don't see the people." "They didn't count on the people pushing back," Ethan said. "No," Moss said. "They counted on the people not having the money to push back." He paused. "You had less money than most, and you pushed back anyway." Ethan handed the letter back. "Is it enough to protect the Hartley bench?" "The inquiry has suspended all pending challenges in the county pending investigation." Hartley's challenge was one of them. "Yes, he's protected at least for now." Ethan nodded. He thought about the man on the east bench holding out alone. The same way he'd held out alone, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, and wasn't quite relief, but was close to both. "What about the properties Price already bought?" Ethan asked. "Connolly and the others." Moss put the letter back in his pocket. "That's more complicated. The sales were legal even if the terms were predatory. The investigation may surface fraud in the pricing, but recovering the land." He shook his head. "That's a harder road." "Connolly needed the money," Ethan said. "He took what was offered because he had to." "I know," Moss said. He paused. "Some things can't be fully undone. But Price won't be doing it to anyone else in this valley." Ethan picked up his fence tool. "That'll have to be enough," he said. It wasn't entirely enough. He carried Connolly's situation in the back of his mind, the way he carried most things that couldn't be fixed. Present acknowledged, set aside, so it didn't interfere with the work that could be done. He drove the next post. Charlotte rode out that afternoon, and he told her about the commissioner's inquiry while they walked the North 40 together, checking the wheat one last time before the real cold came. The field had done exactly what he'd hoped. Full tiller development, healthy root systems, the green of it muted now to the gray-green of a crop settling in for winter, but alive underneath building strength below the surface. She listened to everything he said about Price and the inquiry and the Hartley bench, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, walking beside him with her hands in her coat pockets. "Connolly won't get his land back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably not," Ethan said. She was quiet again. "He had that land 30 years, she said. "His father broke the sod on it." "I know. Some things," she said, and stopped and started again. "Some things can't be fixed by being right, even when you're right." "No," he said. "They can't." She walked another few steps. "But you didn't let it happen to you," she said. "And you didn't let it happen to Hartley." "You helped with that," he said. "The recording number." She shook her head slightly. "You rode 4 days to the Capitol and 4 days back, and you found the survey in a room full of ledgers," she said. "The number just told you where to look." "Where to look was the difference between finding it and not," he said. She stopped walking. She turned to face him in the middle of the wheat field, the gray-green crop around them, the October sky cold and wide overhead. "Ethan," she said. "Charlotte," he said. She looked at him with the full directness that was her most Charlotte quality. No deflection, no management, just the truth of what she was about to say, laid out cleanly in front of her. "I've been practical my whole life," she said. "About land, about decisions, about people. I don't make choices I haven't thought through." "I know," he said. "I've thought this through," she said. "Every part of it. The land, the work, the kind of man you are when no one's making you be that man. I've watched you for 5 months, and I've thought it through, and I'm telling you now that my answer is yes, before you've asked the question properly, so that when you do ask it, you know what's coming." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved across the wheat field between them. "That's the most words you've said at one time," he said. She didn't look away. "I meant all of it," she said. He reached into his coat pocket. He'd been carrying what was there for 3 days, waiting for the right moment, and he'd decided this morning that the right moment was not going to announce itself with ceremony. It was just going to be a moment that was right, and he would know it when it came. He held out his hand. In his palm was a ring, simple silver, a small stone that had belonged to his mother, the only thing of hers he'd carried across 3 states and 7 years of working other men's land. Charlotte looked at it. She looked at him. "I don't have a grand estate," he said. "I have 63 acres, and a good well, and a field of winter wheat that's going to make it through. I have work I know how to do, and I do it right the first time. And I have—" He stopped, chose his words, the way he chose everything carefully. "I have more respect for you than I have words to say it with. More than that, if I'm honest." She was very still. "Marry me," he said. "Be my partner on that land. Build it with me." Charlotte Hayes looked at the ring in his hand, and then at his face, and then at the wheat field around them that they had both fought for, with water and seed, and legal documents, and fire breaks, cut in the September smoke. And she reached out and took the ring from his palm and put it on her own finger, and said, "Yes." Just that. One word. The most certain word he'd ever heard. She told her father that evening. Ethan sat at the table, and Samuel sat across from him, while Charlotte stood near the window and said what had happened in the wheat field, and Samuel listened to the whole thing without moving. When she finished, Samuel looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He looked at Ethan with the full weight of a man who has raised a daughter alone and has spent her whole life trying to prepare her for the world, and now finds himself at the moment where preparation becomes release. "She's the most valuable thing I have," Samuel said. His voice was level, but it had something in it that cost him. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that's still true." Samuel nodded slowly. He reached across the table and put his hand on Ethan's forearm. Not a handshake, not a pat on the shoulder, something more than either of those, a gesture that had in it all the things Samuel Hayes had never been able to say quickly or easily about trust and acceptance, and the particular vulnerability of a man who loves someone and has to let someone else do the loving. He held it for a moment. Then he let go and picked up his coffee cup and said, "Spring wedding makes sense. Ground'll be thawed. Wheat'll be showing." Charlotte turned from the window and looked at her father with an expression that was doing several things at once, the most visible of which was love, plain and unguarded, and not trying to be anything else. "Spring," she said. "Spring," Ethan said. "Ethan." Samuel drank his coffee. "You'll need to add a room to that house," he said. "The front room's too small and the kitchen needs a proper window." "I was planning on it," Ethan said. "I've got lumber," Samuel said. "Good pine been drying 2 years. I won't hear arguments about it." Ethan looked at him. Samuel was looking at his coffee cup with the studied neutrality of a man who has just given something and is not going to make a production of it. "Thank you, Samuel," Ethan said. "Don't thank me," Samuel said. "Build it right." Yeah. Roy Cutter heard about the engagement before the week was out. This was inevitable. He heard it at the feed store from Amos, who told him in the same mild tone he used for everything, and Roy stood at the counter for a moment processing information that did not fit the shape of the story he'd been carrying for 5 months. He left without buying anything. He came back an hour later and bought what he needed and didn't say a word about Ethan Walker, or Charlotte Hayes, or the Alderman place, or winter wheat, or water rights. Amos noticed. Amos said nothing. But when Ethan came in 2 days later for lamp oil and wire, Amos said, "Roy was in yesterday," in the conversational tone of a man sharing weather information. I heard, Ethan said. Didn't say a word about you, Amos said. Ethan set his list on the counter. Good, he said. First time in 5 months, Amos said. Good, Ethan said again. Amos smiled at his counter. He filled the order. He charged Ethan fare same as always, and when Ethan picked up his supplies, Amos said, Congratulations, by the way. Charlotte Hayes is a fine woman. She is, Ethan said. Best I've ever known. Amos nodded. You'll do right by her. Every day, Ethan said. He walked out into the November cold and loaded his horse and rode home. The winter came hard in the first week of November and stayed. The temperature dropped and held the kind of Montana cold that was serious and committed, and Ethan watched the wheat go dormant under the frozen ground and trusted what he'd built below the surface. The roots were there. The tiller structure was there. The variety had been chosen for exactly this for cold that went deep and stayed long and tested whether you'd done the preparation right. He'd done the preparation right. He spent the winter months on the house. The lumber Samuel sent was good pine, straight-grained and well-dried, and Ethan built the new room off the east side with the same care he'd put into the fence posts and the drainage channel. Every joint fitted clean, every board level. Nothing done for appearance that wasn't also done for strength. Charlotte came over twice a week through the winter. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she brought her soil notes, and they sat at the table and planned the spring planting together, what to put in the south pasture once the fencing was done, where the first cattle would graze, how to stage the orchard preparation on the east slope. They worked side by side at the table the way they'd worked side by side at the fire break. No performance, no pretense. Just two people who understood the same things building the same thing together. Samuel came out once with Dolan to look at the room framing and walked the whole structure without speaking, checking the joinery and the load-bearing points and the window placement, and when he was done he said, "You cut the rafters right," which from Samuel Hayes was a technical assessment, and also something more. "I've built a few things," Ethan said. "I know," Samuel said. "Charlotte told me about the operation in Wyoming, Hartley's place." He paused. "She's done more research on your work history than she's let on." Ethan looked at him. "Is that right?" "She looked up Galt, too," Samuel said. "The Wyoming farmer with the winter wheat. Wrote him a letter. He wrote back." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What did he say?" "That you were the best hand he'd had in 20 years, Samuel said. "That you left because there was nothing left to build." He looked at the room framing. "He said you always left when there was nothing left to build." "That's accurate," Ethan said. Samuel looked at him. "You won't run out of things to build here," he said. It was not quite a statement, and not quite a question. "No," Ethan said. "I won't." Samuel nodded. He put on his gloves. "Good pine," he said, meaning the lumber. He walked out, and Dolan followed him, and Ethan stood alone in the framed room with the winter light coming through the rough window opening, and thought about a woman who had written a letter to Wyoming on his behalf and never said a word about it. That evening, Charlotte came by with a pot of soup she'd made that morning. She set it on the stove, looked at the room framing, and walked through it with her hand trailing along the studs, the way she walked fence lines. "You cut the rafters right," she said. "Your father said the same thing," Ethan said. She turned and looked at him. "He doesn't say that often," she said. "I know," Ethan said. He looked at her. "You wrote a letter to Wyoming." She went still. "Galt wrote back to your father," Ethan said. Charlotte held his gaze. She didn't look away, and she didn't apologize. "I wanted to know who you were before you came here," she said. "I wanted to know if what I was seeing was who you always were, or just who you were in front of me." "And?" he said. "Same man," she said. "Every place you went, every person who knew you said the same thing. Works hard, works right. Leaves when there's nothing left to build." She paused. "I needed to know if there was enough here to make you stay." He looked at her for a long moment. "Charlotte," he said. "I know," she said. "I should have told you." "I'm not upset," he said. "I'm—" He stopped, found the word. "I'm glad someone checked. A woman ought to know who she's marrying." She let out a breath. "I know who I'm marrying," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That's what I'm glad about." She looked at him for another moment, and the winter light in the framed room was thin and cold, but there was warmth in it somehow. The warmth that comes not from heat, but from being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, with exactly the right person beside you. She handed him a bowl of soup. He took it. They sat at his table in the half-built house and ate together in the comfortable silence of two people who had run out of things to prove to each other, and found that what was left, once all the proving was done, was better than either of them had let themselves expect. The wheat came up in March. It came up the way things come up, that have spent a long winter building strength underground, fast even committed the green of it, sharp against the last of the frost-pale ground. Ethan walked the rows the first morning he saw it, and crouched down and looked at the new growth, the way he'd looked at it in September up close, checking the health of it, confirming what he'd built was holding. It was holding. Better than holding. The winter had done what good winters do for winter. Wheat pushed the roots deeper, strengthened the tiller structure, made the plant commit to the ground it was in. Charlotte was there that morning. She'd ridden over before breakfast, when the light was still low and thin, and she walked the rows behind him without speaking for a while, and then she crouched beside him and looked at the growth and said, "Even germination across the whole 40. Better than even," he said. "Look at the tiller density on the north end." She looked. She was quiet for a moment. "You were right," she said. "About all of it. The variety, the timing, the raw orientation." She paused. "I was right too." "You were right too," he said. "About everything." She stood up and looked out across the green field. "My father is going to want to see this," she said. "He's welcome," Ethan said. "He'll pretend he's just riding past," she said. "I know," Ethan said. "I'll pretend I don't notice." She looked at him with the expression that was her version of amusement, subtle, real, entirely hers. "You've learned him," she said. "Took a while," Ethan said. "He's a patient teacher." She laughed. It was a small sound, quiet and genuine, and it was the first time he'd heard it full and unguarded, and it was better than he'd expected, which was saying something because he'd expected it to be good. He stood up beside her. They stood at the edge of the wheat field in the March morning, the new crop at their feet. The east tributary, running clean below the property. The house behind them, with its new room framed and half-finished. "Spring," she said. "You ready?" he said. She turned and looked at him, the full look all the way and nothing held back. "I've been ready," she said. "I was waiting for you to be ready." "I've been ready since September," he said. She raised one eyebrow. "The fire," she said. "You decided in the fire. I decided at the creek," he said. "When you told me the rope angle was wrong." She stared at him. "First day I met you," he said. "I knew." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "You could have mentioned that." "You had the recording number in your pocket for 3 years," he said. "We both had things we weren't mentioning." She looked at him for another moment. Then she shook her head slowly, and the almost smile became the real thing, complete and unguarded, and entirely worth the 5 months of waiting to see it. And she turned back to the wheat and said, "Spring wedding then, before the wheat needs tending." "Before the wheat needs tending," he agreed. 10. Samuel Hayes rode past the North 40 on a Tuesday in the second week of March, the way Charlotte had predicted. He pulled up at the fence line and looked at the wheat for a long time without getting off his horse. Ethan was working the south pasture fence, and he could see his future father-in-law from 200 yards away, sitting his horse at the field's edge looking. He didn't call out. He kept working. After a few minutes, Samuel turned his horse and rode south toward his own land. And as he passed the corner of the south fence where Ethan was working, he slowed and looked at the new fence post's tight level, same quality as everything else. "South pasture'll be ready for cattle by May," Ethan said without looking up from his work. "I know," Samuel said. "I can see the work." A pause. "You need a hand with the remaining section," Samuel asked. Ethan straightened up and looked at him. Samuel was sitting his horse with the particular posture of a man who has just offered something, and is prepared to be declined, and is prepared to be accepted, and has no preference between them, which was not entirely true, but was what he showed. "I'd appreciate the help," Ethan said. "Saturday." "Saturday," Samuel said. He rode on. Ethan watched him go, and thought about a man who had lost everything once, and built it back right, and who was now offering his Saturday mornings to help someone else build something right, not because he owed it, or because anyone was watching, but because it was the kind of thing a good man did when he recognized the same work in someone else. He thought about what Charlotte had said in the wheat field that morning in September, when she'd said the rope angle was wrong, and he'd been in the creek up to his thighs, and the old horse was going down. He thought about how a thing can begin before you know it's beginning in the most ordinary moment with the most practical words. A rope angle, a creek bank, a horse that needed help. Everything since then. The well, the wheat, the fire, the legal fight, the Sunday suppers, the ring that had crossed 3 states in his coat pocket. All of it had grown from that one morning at the creek from 2 people who understood the same problem and solved it together without being asked. That was the whole of it, he thought. That was how it worked. Not in declarations or dramatic moments, but in the daily proof, the practical, honest, unglamorous daily proof of who a person was when the situation asked something of them and no one was making them give it. He picked up his post digger and went back to work. May. They married on the first Saturday in April when the ground was soft enough to work and the wheat was ankle-high and the east tributary was running full and clear from the spring thaw. The ceremony was small. Moss was there, and Amos and Dolan and the Hayes Ranch hands, and the Hartley man from the East Bench, who had come down specifically because he'd heard what Ethan had done at the hearing and wanted to shake his hand. Roy Cutter was not there. This surprised no one and bothered no one. Samuel Hayes stood beside his daughter at the front of the small church in Harlan Creek, and when the moment came to give her away, he did it with the same directness. He did everything, no hesitation, no performance, just a father putting his daughter's hand into the hand of the man she'd chosen, and trusting what he'd seen with his own eyes for 7 months. He sat down in the front pew and looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at his daughter and the man beside her, and what was on his face briefly and completely was the expression of a man who has done the most difficult thing a parent can do, and found it was also the right thing, and discovered that right and difficult could be the same thing, and that this was all right. The preacher said what preachers say. Ethan looked at Charlotte through all of it, and Charlotte looked at Ethan, and what passed between them in those looks was everything that had been said and unsaid across 7 months of fence lines and wheat rows and legal hearings and fire breaks and Sunday suppers, and 2 people learning each other the only way that matters by watching what the other person did when it cost them something. When it was done, Charlotte Walker. Charlotte Hayes. Walker, she decided, because her father's name had earned its place in hers, walked out of the church on her husband's arm into the April morning, and the light hit the valley the way it does in early spring, when the worst of winter is truly over, clean and direct, and without apology. She looked at the hills. She looked at Ethan. "The wheat needs checking," she said. He looked at her. "It'll keep," he said. She considered that. "It will," she agreed. They walked to their horses. Ethan untied them and handed Charlotte her reins, and she took them and mounted up with the ease of a woman who had been on horseback her whole life and would be for the rest of it. He mounted beside her. They rode north together, up the road that ran along the ridge, the same road she had ridden past the Alderman place 100 times before she knew his name, the same road where he had watched her from the fence line and gone back to his work and not let himself think about it. The wheat was visible from the ridge, a green field on ground that had been dead and tired and given up on, now alive and committed, and building toward harvest. Charlotte looked at it. Ethan looked at her, looking at it. "You were right," she said. "About the ground." "You were right about the rows," he said. She nodded slowly. "We were both right," she said. "We usually are," he said, "when we're together." She looked at him with the expression that was entirely and permanently hers, the one he had earned over 7 months of doing things right for no other reason than that it was right to do them, and she said, "Then we'd better stay together." "Yes, ma'am," Ethan Walker said, and they rode down from the ridge toward the land they had built together, and the wheat grew and the water ran clean, and the valley held them, the way good land holds the people who are willing to hold it back with patience, with permanence, and with the deep and quiet certainty of something that was never going to let go.